How do you shoot down a bomber the U.S. Air Force itself believes is unbeatable? Not with better technology, not with more fighter jets. In December 1972, Hanoi had one type of missile already considered outdated by the standards of its own era, and fewer than 50 fighter jets capable of air combat. Their opponent was the largest heavy bomber force assembled since World War II, the B-52 Stratofortress, a machine that could carry more bombs than almost any bomber in history, shielded by an entire fleet of electronic warfare aircraft, fighter escorts, and radar jamming planes. 12 days and nights later, the Americans themselves would have to admit it. That fortress in the sky was not invincible after all. And the Vietnamese gave this campaign a name of their own, a name that called back with eerie precision to something that had happened 18 years earlier on an entirely different battlefield, Dien Bien Phu in the air. This is the story of how that actually happened. It began with a negotiation that collapsed. On December 13, 1972, North Vietnamese negotiators walked out of the Paris peace talks, rejecting the latest American proposals and refusing to set a date to return. President Nixon had already prepared for exactly this scenario weeks earlier, telling his Joint Chiefs of Staff he wanted a military response that would be, in his own words, massive and effective. There was one target he insisted on above all others: Hanoi itself, a city that had enjoyed sanctuary status for most of the war. Just 5 days after the talks broke down, on the night of December 18th, American B-52s struck the North Vietnamese capital with an intensity not seen since World War II. On the first night, 129 B-52s took off, 87 of them from Guam. It took nearly 2 hours just for the Guam formation to taxi, launch, and assemble in the air, the largest bomber force ever assembled for a single mission since World War II. Facing them was a Hanoi air defense network built around 36 missile battalions armed with the Soviet-designed SA-2, roughly half of them actively engaged in the fight, backed by a small, aging fleet of MiG interceptors. The first wave targeted military airfields around Hanoi and a supply depot. The second and third waves struck straight into the heart of the city. But that very first night, while American pilots believed the sky belonged entirely to them, 3 B-52s were shot down by surface-to-air missiles from Hanoi's air defense forces. This was the moment that made the Pentagon go quiet. The most expensive aircraft in the entire U.S. Air Force, protected more heavily than almost anything else in the arsenal, were falling out of the sky, brought down by a missile American intelligence had assessed as 1950s technology. The problem, it turned out, was never the weapon. It was the overconfidence of the men who planned the attack. Strategic Air Command had ordered the entire formation to fly the same route, the same altitude, the same time window, night after night, for one simple reason: keep the formation tight to maximize electronic jamming. Dozens of support aircraft flew alongside every wave: F-4 Phantom fighter escorts, F-105 Wild Weasel jets hunting for missile sites, chaff-dropping planes laying corridors of confusion across enemy radar. On paper, the sky belonged to the Americans almost completely. But a formation that looked unstoppable from the outside was, from the ground, becoming entirely predictable. Picture this from the ground, at a missile battery on the outskirts of Hanoi, the night of December 20th into 21st. The crew had been at their posts for 3 straight nights, barely sleeping, living on rationed food, and stolen minutes of rest between alerts. By now, their logs held enough data to plot, almost to the minute, exactly when, from which direction, and at what altitude the B-52s would appear, not from any sophisticated reconnaissance, but simply because the enemy had flown the same path for a 4th consecutive night. When the radar signature appeared exactly where predicted, all that was left to do was wait for the right instant to fire. This was a strange echo of history repeating itself. 18 years earlier, at Dien Bien Phu, the French army had placed absolute faith in a stronghold built on classic Western military doctrine, and paid dearly for failing to anticipate how differently their opponent would adapt to the terrain. Now, in the skies over Hanoi, that same rigidity in American air power doctrine, repeating a pattern simply because it was believed to be optimal, had become the fatal flaw. This wasn't a coincidence repeating itself twice by accident. It was evidence of a skill honed across generations, the ability to see straight through an opponent's confidence and find the exact point they believed could never be exploited. Whether that opponent was the French colonial army in 1954 or the most advanced air force on the planet in 1972. Technology can be bought. The instinct to spot that blind spot cannot. The 4th night of the campaign, December 21st, became one of the worst nights for the American side. The second wave was aborted midway after the first wave had already lost 3 B-52s in a single night. But command still ordered the third wave to fly the same route, the same time window used the nights before. Hanoi's air defenses, now knowing the pattern by heart, were waiting. By Christmas, the U.S. announced a 24-hour bombing halt, officially to let planners review the campaign and give aircrews some rest after a week of relentless flying. Hanoi read that pause very differently, as a sign of wavering resolve, and used every hour of it to rush fresh missiles to batteries that were running dangerously low after a week of non-stop combat. Trucks moved through the night, restocking launchers that had been fired down to their last rounds. After the pause, both sides entered a genuine battle of wits. The Americans changed tactics, varying flight paths, constantly changing altitude, adding targets outside the Hanoi-Haiphong area to confuse the air defense network, giving pilots more flexibility instead of the rigid patterns of the first nights. For 3 consecutive nights afterward, not a single B-52 was shot down, a clear improvement, and proof that the campaign's early losses had, in fact, been avoidable all along. From the cockpit, the sheer intensity of the campaign left its own mark on the men flying it. One B-52 pilot, taking off from Guam, that stretch later recalled the breathless rhythm of it. A plane leaving the runway every single minute, hour after hour, without a break. It was American air power at its peak. But that same mechanical, repeating rhythm was quietly writing a pattern the enemy below could memorize by heart. But Hanoi wasn't standing still either. Early warning radar was recalibrated to catch the new flight paths. Missile batteries learned to pick out B-52s even through denser jamming, sometimes switching guidance radar off for a few seconds and back on at exactly the right instant to avoid being locked onto by American anti-radiation missiles, a cat-and-mouse game that demanded split-second calculation. What's easy to miss is that the people performing these split-second calculations were, for the most part, very young, many barely in their 20s, with no formal training for countering the most sophisticated electronic jamming system in the world, simply because no one had ever had to counter it before. There was no manual for switching radar on and off to dodge anti-radiation missiles. No classroom that had ever taught this exact skill. That tactic was invented and refined in the middle of combat nights, through trial and through cost, passed from one crew to the next between raids, sometimes only hours before the next wave of bombers appeared on the radar screen. December 26th was the night everything tipped in a harder direction for Hanoi. This was the largest single strike of the entire campaign. 120 B-52s attacking simultaneously from 7 different directions, converging on the city almost at once, each wave exposed to the air defense net for less than 15 minutes, a radical shift from the 60 to 90 minutes of the first nights. The compressed timing meant Hanoi's defenders had almost no window to track, decide, and fire before the bombers were already turning for home. At the same time, Hanoi's missile stockpile was running dry after nearly a week and a half of continuous combat. That same day, 2 missile storage depots were hit. That night, facing the largest coordinated strike of the campaign with dwindling ammunition, Hanoi's air defenses still brought down enemy aircraft, a more modest result than the first nights, but enough to show that even at the campaign's hardest moment, they hadn't laid down their weapons. That same night of December 26th, bombs also fell on a place no military plan could ever justify what happened next. Kham Thien Street, a densely packed neighborhood in the heart of Hanoi, where houses had stood shoulder to shoulder for generations, where families had lived above the same small shops for decades. That night, hundreds of civilians were killed, among them women, the elderly, and children, entire families lost in a single moment. Thousands of homes, schools, temples, and other buildings were destroyed or badly damaged. It was one of the most sorrowful nights of the entire 12 days. A reminder that behind every military statistic, behind every story of tactics and hardware, there are always families, streets, ordinary lives caught in a war they never chose. But even after that night of grief, the city did not go silent. Within hours, the air defense batteries around Hanoi were back at their posts as usual, ready for the next wave. Grief did not shake the defense line. If anything, it only hardened the resolve of the people standing at those positions. For the American side, the official cost of the entire campaign came to somewhere between 15 and 16 B-52s shot down, a loss rate the U.S. Air Force itself admitted was far higher than expected. Some independent analyses since then, including after-action reports from Soviet military advisors present in Hanoi at the time, suggest the true toll may have been higher still, if aircraft damaged beyond repair are counted. Among the crews involved in those losses, dozens became prisoners of war, men who would spend the campaign's final weeks in captivity, their names later appearing on lists exchanged in the prisoner repatriation talks that followed the ceasefire. A direct human consequence of those December nights that no bomb tonnage figure could ever capture. By the final days of the campaign, Hanoi's missile reserves were nearly exhausted after 10 days of continuous combat. Crews were down to counting individual rounds, choosing targets with a precision born of scarcity rather than abundance. But even with ammunition down to a handful of rounds, they brought down one more B-52 on December 28th, the final kill of the air defense campaign, fired from batteries that, by any reasonable military logic, should have already gone silent. By December 29th, almost no missiles were being fired at all, and the operation officially ended in the early hours of the 30th. 3 days earlier, Hanoi's leadership had signaled to Washington a willingness to resume talks in early January. There are different ways to read that signal. The Americans at the time believed the bombing had forced Hanoi to concede. But when the final peace agreement was signed in Paris on January 27, 1973, its terms were, in substance, barely different from what had already been on the table before the bombing began. American troops would withdraw. Prisoners of war on both sides would be returned home. The political questions that had divided North and South Vietnam remained exactly where they had been left in October. Unresolved, deferred, essentially unchanged. It was in fact so close to the original terms that one of Kissinger's own aides later admitted bluntly, "We bombed the North Vietnamese into accepting our own concessions." In other words, despite dropping more than 20,000 tons of bombs on Hanoi and Haiphong, the largest heavy bomber campaign since World War II, America ultimately arrived back at exactly the point where the negotiations had stalled before. This is what gives the name Dien Bien Phu in the air its real meaning. Not because America's losses match the scale of the 1954 defeat. In purely military terms, the U.S. retained air superiority throughout the campaign. What makes the name accurate to the point of chilling is its symbolism. A Western military power believing its technological edge could never be challenged, and that very certainty becoming the opening its opponent exploited, while on the other side, with a small handful of fighters and a missile stockpile rationed round by round, the defenders held on for all 12 days and nights, bringing down a supposedly invincible weapon right up to the moment their ammunition nearly ran out. This is the thread running through 30 straight years of war this nation endured. Real strength was never about owning the most advanced weapon. It was the ability to turn whatever resources were on hand, however few, however outdated, down to the last few missiles, into the instrument that decided a victory. That may be the most expensive lesson of the entire campaign. There are limits that not even the most destructive weapon in a superpower's arsenal can cross. And the will of a people who refuse to yield is one of those limits.